With Margaret Brennan in Anchorage, Alaska. Some of you are expecting the CBS Evening News, but we are interrupting because President Trump and President Vladimir Putin of Russia are about to speak to reporters after today's summit.
And today's meeting closed doors, and it lasted about 3 hours. President Trump was joined in that room by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Vladimir Putin had two of his top foreign policy advisors, and we are looking at the room here, John, where you can see the press is assembling, and right there, Kirill Dmitriev, one of the top advisors to Vladimir Putin. We're looking at the back of his head. It looks like this is about to start imminently.
And since it is, let's jump to Nancy Cordes right away, because we may not be able to talk to her for a long while. Nancy, what do you know?
Well, John and Margaret, as Kirill Dmitriev, who you were mentioning, Margaret, walked into the room, reporters swarmed around him because everyone is trying to figure out exactly what is going on, why this press conference is suddenly taking place sooner than expected, before the second of two planned meetings has even taken place. Reporters wondering whether something has gone badly, and so the meetings are wrapping up early, or perhaps whether President Trump and President Putin have a major breakthrough to announce and wanted to tell the world about it right away. Or perhaps President Trump is just aware that it is 6:30 on the East Coast and he wants to talk to reporters and the country before it gets too late on a Friday night. All of those are possibilities. The fact that Russian officials are in the room and that we saw a Russian aide testing out the microphone at one of the podiums would indicate that President Trump is going to appear side by side with Vladimir Putin, which is not something you would anticipate would happen if things were going badly. So that is a positive sign.
All right, Nancy, let's bring in now Ambassador John Sullivan. He served in Moscow during the first Trump administration, and he was also former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State. Ambassador, the benchmark for success had been set at ceasefire. What are you listening for in these first few moments when the leaders begin speaking?
Well, you've hit the first issue, Margaret, ceasefire. The second one is, when is someone going to talk to Zelensky? If there's going to be peace, if there's going to be a real ceasefire, the Ukrainians and Zelensky have to be intimately involved. So when's the meeting with Zelensky? What's next? Putin just saying there's going to be a ceasefire doesn't really mean that much. It's going to take a lot to implement, and it's going to require the Ukrainians' participation.
Ambassador, if you were running the show here, would you make a call to Zelensky, let him know what happened? In other words, keeping him close to the negotiations and quelling that fear that they have in Europe, and that he certainly has, which is that his fortunes are being carved up in Alaska and he's not at the table?
Well, certainly if I were serious about trying to get peace in Ukraine, I would still stay close to President Zelensky and keep him involved, because, as I said before, the participation of the Ukrainians is going to be key. It was the Ukrainians themselves, so led by Zelensky, who successfully resisted the original Russian invasion. They're going to have to be satisfied with whatever Putin and President Trump have discussed. So they've got to be involved, and sooner rather than later.
And Ambassador, it's about 1:30 a.m. right now in Kyiv, Ukraine. You have to be betting that Volodymyr Zelensky is waiting for that call. We know European leaders had said they did expect to hear from President Trump. They just didn't know when. I called a number of ambassadors trying to find that out and was told that I perhaps was assuming too much of a strategy, that all of this is very, very dynamic. What does that mean in this context? With complexity and then sort of being, making some of these decisions on the fly, is there a risk here?
Well, sure, there's a risk of miscommunication, messages not being delivered that should have been. But it's all, I think, stems from this very extemporaneously organized meeting between the two presidents. They haven't adhered to the schedule. They're having this press conference now. It's really being done on the fly.
Mm-hmm.
Let's bring in senior foreign correspondent Deborah Patta. Deborah, you are in Europe. Of course, everybody's it's in the middle of the night there, but surely diplomats are watching what we're about to see here.
They certainly are. I'm sure they're glued to their television sets like the rest of us, waiting to see. Nobody expected it to finish this early, John. In fact, people were anticipating, maybe having a little snooze in between or something, waiting, because they expected it to go on for 6 to 7 hours was some of the things that we've heard about this. And what those European leaders are going to be looking for is whether or not President Trump has managed to guide President Putin in terms of the 5 principles that they discussed in a call with President Zelensky earlier this week. And key to that is, firstly, refusing to discuss any peace terms like swaps of land between Russia and Ukraine before a ceasefire is put in place. They said that Ukraine would be willing to discuss changes in territory, including ceding some land to Russia, but that it would not discuss legally recognizing Russia's occupation of parts of the country once that ceasefire had been put in place. And they also wanted some kinds of security guarantees for Ukraine after the war. Now, whether they even got that far in this meeting remains to be seen. What they're also hoping for is a call from President Trump to firstly Zelensky and possibly to some of those European leaders to say what the next step is. And that could be a meeting as early as the next few days. That's if, again, the talks manage to get that far, John.
And we do know, John, that there is already talk of a trilateral meeting, but that happened before this began. You know, President Trump saying, hey, maybe it'll be here in Alaska. But as I was reminded, President Zelensky can't get here that quickly. So it's not going to happen tonight. It is the middle of the night there, and he can't fly out. Also, I'd be interested in some of our contributors' views on this. But the image of your Zelensky, of coming to the place where your fortunes were discussed by the American president and the Russian president, it puts you in a different posture. And you could imagine that not being something he would rush to do unless it was a really good deal, because there will be the suspicion that whatever deal has been brokered is not to Ukraine's advantage. Well, let's bring in national security contributor for CBS News, Samantha Vinograd. Samantha, you served in the last administration that threw every piece of sanction they could at President Putin to try to dissuade him from continuing this war. Financial punishment didn't work. What will?
The only thing that is ultimately going to work over the long term, Margaret, is financial pressure. That is largely based upon the fact that for President Putin, seizing and maintaining control over territory in Ukraine is an existential issue. President Putin is committed to the idea of Mother Russia that is commensurate with the USSR and in certain degrees with the empire that fell in 1917. So for President Putin, agreeing to relinquish territory in Ukraine, again, is an existential issue. And the only thing that is going to change that in his mind is sustained economic pressure. And you are right. The Biden administration did throw a lot of sanctions at at Russia. President Obama, whom I've served under as well, also put sanctions on Russia. But the reality is that the Russian economy has started to slow. Growth this year is projected only about 1% as energy exports are declining. The budget deficit is widening, and the economy is stagnating, if not leaning towards recession. So sanctions have to be sustained, and they have to be enhanced. So I will be watching to hear whether President Trump and President Putin discuss any lessening of economic sanctions. We know that President Putin wants that. Or if President Trump puts on the table his real Trump card, which is enhanced sanctions against countries that continue to buy Russian oil, like China, like Turkey. So I'll be very attuned to whether there is an economic component of this press conference.
Samantha Vinograd, thank you. Let's go back to Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, we understand there's been a little bit of a schedule flip here between the lunch and the press conference. What do you know?
Correct. And the question is, what's the significance? Because the way this day was supposed to play out was that President Trump was going to hold a smaller, more intimate 3-on-3 meeting with President Putin first two Trump advisors, two Putin advisors, including the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. That meeting did take place. It's lasted 2.5 to 3 hours. And then they were supposed to move into a larger lunch session that included more officials like the Treasury Secretary, the Commerce Secretary, the Defense Secretary on the White House side, and then more Russian officials as well. What's unclear at this point is whether plans have flipped and the press conference is just going to take place now because there is some news that the president and President Putin want to share immediately, or if that second large meeting is going away entirely. That's the question we've been posing to White House officials, to Russian officials who are here in the room, but we haven't gotten an answer yet.
All right, Nancy Cordes there in that loud press conference room. I want to go back to John Sullivan, former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Ambassador, apparently the current Russian ambassador to Washington said to his media, there is a toxic legacy from the previous administration, but now the tone of communication with the American side is working and result-oriented. How do you interpret that other than saying it was a friendly past 3 hours?
Well, certainly there is a toxic legacy created by Putin and his government brutally invading Ukraine, waging an aggressive war, killing large numbers of innocent people. So, yeah, I mean, what Putin and his government have done is toxic. President Trump is committed to try to make peace in Ukraine. He's going about it by inviting Putin here to the United States, welcoming him on a red carpet. We'll see if that ultimately succeeds. I'm skeptical because I believe Putin is not going to change his war aims, which is to subjugate Ukraine, his war aim, without substantially more pressure, economic pressure, and convincing Putin that the West is going to continue to support Ukraine militarily so that Ukraine can continue to successfully resist the Russian military's incursion.
Ambassador, just to reset and put things in context, the pursuing peace is the word splashed on the background up there for the press conference we're expecting. Vladimir Putin could pursue peace by just stopping his invasion.
Of course, we've been saying that in the Biden administration. The United States government has been saying that for years. This war could end right now if the Russian military stopped its aggression. This is a war that was started by Putin without justification and has been waged in a brutal and aggressive way. It could stop today if Putin decided to do so. He hasn't made that decision. He is still pursuing his war aims. He has to be pressured to change his mind, and so far, the United States has not applied pressure to Putin to make that change.
Ambassador, I want to ask you quickly, though, one thing that has changed in the language, particularly from the NATO Secretary General who joined me last Sunday, he started saying de facto versus de jure. I know that sounds like Latin gibberish, but he was talking basically about a diplomatic way to sort of say, OK, maybe hold on to some of that territory. We won't officially legally recognize it. We'll leave it up to negotiation in regard to what happens with withdrawal of troops. Tell us what we need to be listening for here when it comes to that eastern part of Ukraine.
Well, particularly with the eastern part of Ukraine in the Donbass and Crimea, the president has, and his administration, President Trump, has suggested that the United States may be willing to go so far as to say, to concede, not only in fact does Russia control that territory, but that lawfully it is now part of the Russian Federation, which Putin claims. It's been the position of the West that the most that the West would concede for Putin is that there would be de facto recognition that, of course, the Russian military is occupying this territory, but not doing so lawfully. The key that we have to look for is that there's no concession by the administration that somehow Putin's aggression, his committing the war crime, the crime against peace, waging an aggressive war to seize territory, is going to be recognized by the United States government as a lawful acquisition of that territory. That would be an extraordinary thing.
Help people understand why that would be an extraordinary thing, the global stakes of that and the historical line that appears to cross, which is that sovereign nation. Oh, we see some reporters in the room standing. I don't want to. We may be very close, but what kind of a line that historically would cross in terms of the norm that boundaries of nations are supposed to not be sovereign nations are not supposed to be attacked?
Well, think about this, John. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Iraq invaded Kuwait. The UN Security Council voted to authorize military force to expel Iraq from Kuwait because one nation can't invade another to seize that nation's territory. That was passed multiple resolutions by the UN Security Council. In the United States, President George H.W. Bush organized a large coalition of countries to expel Iraq from Kuwait and defend the proposition that aggressive war that's waged to seize another country's territory, cannot be accepted. If the United States recognizes today that Putin lawfully seized Crimea and the Donbass, the territory that they have, it will turn that notion, that proposition on its head.
We know that envoy Steve Witkoff has entered that room, John. That's what that flurry of activity was. We're watching one by one some of these top advisors enter the room, which means the presidents are getting close, and we would expect questions to go to both leaders, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump here. Ambassador Sullivan, what's the first question you would ask Vladimir Putin?
Well, he's already been asked some questions, and we saw them some earlier today. You know, are you willing to
he pretended he didn't hear.
Exactly. He pretended he didn't hear. He understands English, and he heard. Are you willing today to declare that you will stop killing innocent Ukrainians? You'll stop the attacks on Ukraine. Will you stop today? President Trump has said that's his measure of success. Are you going to meet President Trump's standard?
Just to update viewers on where we are, President Putin and President Trump have met for more than 2 hours. We have heard that they're done. We've seen President Putin certainly walking through the hallway. They are done with that portion of the day. We are awaiting the two presidents to step to the podiums for a joint press conference, and then they are, we understand, to have lunch, the broader meeting with more advisors after this press conference. But we are all here waiting for the two of them to walk out. It could happen really at any moment. And you see members of the audience there, both officials.
There's Steve Witkoff walking across the room.
Filtering in, as well as reporters popping up in anticipation. So we may very well be moments away.
You know, we are reading every headline the Kremlin is putting out, and they are doing so furiously, John. And the Russian media, heavily influenced by the state there. The defense minister just told reporters he was in an excellent mood after the talks. From what we know, though, it's just the 3x3, the Secretary of State, and the president and envoy Witkoff, who just walked across the screen. The military advisors who flew in, and that was a last-minute ad, as far as we know, they haven't joined the conversation. And that will be interesting. Do we hear at this podium that there is an announcement to keep talking and to speak about what a ceasefire looks like, and to have at that table not just the Secretary of Defense, not just the top military advisor to the president, but the supreme allied commander who also commands U.S. troops? That's a very big statement to reassure Europe as well.
Right. And also what will be interesting is how much weight they offer. In other words, you and I talked about this earlier, analysts saying that Putin will be convinced to move away from his previous positions by a credible, essentially, threat from the U.S. And are the military advisors there to carry that out, or is it a part of another part of an inducement? One of the things I'm watching for in this press conference is President Trump, in many world leader press conferences, will continue the negotiation in public and try to lock in some gains by saying things in public and essentially asserting that the rival or the alternate world leader has already agreed to them. It's not a sign of respect, but it is effective. And we'll see which of the two, if he engages in any of that today.
What we're seeing here, again, this is all Russian media. The White House is not really sharing any information. We cannot verify this, but what the Russian press is putting out in Russian language is saying that the U.S. and Moscow have prepared documents to restore direct air communication with the United States. The Russian ambassador is here and talking to press and talking about normalizing diplomatic relations, such as returning confiscated diplomatic properties. There's really valuable property throughout this country.
Notably, nothing about anything yet from the Russians about Ukraine.
Not in these statements so far.
And explain to people what those statements are about. They're shaping the environment in which events are going to take place.
Absolutely. So saying we got something for coming here, but another caveat, emphasize that there are no major breakthroughs yet. So changes in visa negotiations. So it sounds like some of the U.S.-Russia business may be handled here, but the big issue, Ukraine and the future of European security, we aren't seeing anything from the Russian narrative come out so far.
Nancy Cordes, who is there in the room as we all await. Oh, that's Lavrov, is it?
Yes.
Yes, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, taking his place. Nancy, the American officials, can you see them? What's their posture?
Yes, we see the president's White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, has entered the room. The Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, is here as well. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, the White House Press Secretary, Caroline Leavitt. So this is an obvious indication, John, that the time for the actual press conference is drawing near. They haven't given anything away. We've been trying to read whatever we can into their comings and goings. But the reality is, A, we don't know what the president plans to announce, and B, we don't know if he's going to announce what the Europeans and the Ukrainians are waiting to hear, which is that Russia has agreed to or moved closer to a ceasefire after 3.5 years of war.
And we've been told that we're in under 2 minutes, probably under a minute now, before the two presidents take the podium. Everybody is aligned in the room. Is that Marco Rubio?
Yes, Secretary of State Rubio, who during his time in the Senate, John, you know this well, longtime Russia hawk, has been a longtime supporter of Ukraine, but is now fully behind the president's policy. And we have to hear what the specifics of it are. But he has been trying to reassure European allies that Ukraine's future won't be carved up at a table in Alaska, but rather at a future one between Ukraine and Russia, where they at least have a negotiation themselves.
Senator Rubio, highly critical of previous American presidents, usually in the other party, in measuring the gap between their rhetoric and the actual strength of their opposition to the Putin regime. So it'll be interesting now that he's got a handle of that brief himself. And fortunately, you'll be talking to him on Sunday. So there's much to discuss.
Well, certainly. And the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is sitting there. As we were hearing from Samantha Vinograd, you know, one of the main weapons used by the United States, because we are not, the United States is not party to the war in Ukraine, but they have unleashed at least a good part of the strength of the U.S. dollar and financial system to hurt Vladimir Putin in the pocketbook. But one of the results of that has also been that Vladimir Putin has grown a lot closer to Xi Jinping of China, one of America's, really America's #1 adversary, according to the Trump administration's worldview. And that is something that President Trump has said he would like to end. We see them now, Vladimir Putin and President Donald Trump taking the podiums.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, our negotiations have been held in a constructive atmosphere of mutual respect. We have very thorough negotiations that were quite useful. I would like to thank once again my American counterpart for the proposal to travel out here to Alaska. It only makes sense that we've met here because our countries, though separated by the oceans, are close neighbors. So when we've met, when I came out of the plane and I've said, Good afternoon, dear neighbor. Very good to see you. In good health and to see you alive. I think that is very neighborly. And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are 2 islands only between the Russian island and the U.S. island. They're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of, more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin. During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. It was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. And there are 2 flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here. The Soviet pilots are buried there who died during that dangerous mission. We're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in the spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they have fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue. And in this case, a personal meeting between the heads of state has been long overdue, naturally under the condition of serious and painstaking work, and this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And special envoy of the president, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kiev and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible. And our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the U.S., there was a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope that we'll succeed in that, in political sphere. I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good business-like and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound, and I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Radcliffe. Thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job. We also have some tremendous Russian business representatives here, and I think, you know, everybody wants to deal with us. We've become the hottest country anywhere in the world in a very short period of time, and we look forward to that. We look forward to dealing. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir. We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax. That made it a little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all. But we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax. But what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over. So just to put it very quickly, I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. but we had an extremely productive meeting, and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, whose faces, who I know in many cases, otherwise, other than that, whose faces I get to see all the time in the newspapers. You're almost as famous as the boss, but especially this one right over here. But we had some good meetings over the years, right? Good, productive meetings over the years, and we hope to have that in the future. But let's do the most productive one right now. We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So, again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That concludes the press conference with President Trump and President Putin, in which they took no questions from the press, which was